My name is Dale Dyer, and I was born December the 8th, 1919, in Clearwater, Kansas. And today I live in Blue Ridge, Georgia. I have lived here since 1947. And we were transferred to Orangeburg, South Carolina. That's where I ended up. And that was our primary training, flying training base. And Orangeburg was a field, and they didn't have any pavement on the field. It was all grassland, and we were flying PT-17 Stearman biplanes, open cockpit, and that's where we had our next 2 months of training in that. And we were there up one day and with my instructor, and our instructors were civilian pilots. And mine was from New Jersey at that time. And we'd been out, and he had me doing figure eights. That's flying about 800 feet above the ground, and they'd pick out 2 points, and they were pylons on the ground, and then we'd fly figure eights around those pylons. First one way and then another way, and that was to create your coordination between your hand controls and your feet controls, keeping the plane flying level. And constantly in one position, and making the right bank on your turns, and holding your altitude and your airspeed and everything. And we'd been up there probably a half hour or longer, and he says, well, take me back to the base. I took him back to the base. He says, now you go back and do that same thing for another half hour or so. So I went back soloing back to do the same thing. I hadn't been back there about 10, 15 minutes. All at once, all this oil come out of the seal of the propeller shaft. Evidently had come apart or something, and it just sucked all the oil out right on the engine, and all the smoke and oil all over me. And there I was, just about 800 feet above ground, and of course we had parachutes on, but that was a little bit to try to bail out at that height. And I looked out, and the whole area was nothing but woods. It was a very heavily wooded area, and I knew the thing was going to freeze up right away, and then I had to start looking to see where I was going to try to fly that plane into the trees or whatever. And so I started letting down, not losing too much speed because the engine quit on me. And I started gliding, and just as I was coming down, a little cotton field, about 4-acre cotton field, was right in front of me, and I cleared the trees and landed, and I stopped short about 30 feet from the end of the field. By the time I got the plane stopped, dead stick. We were sent to Columbus, Mississippi, and we were flying AT-10s, Cessnas, twin engines, and AT-9s, Curtiss Wright airplanes. The AT-9 was a little hotter airplane. The AT-10s, we got in another 65 hours, and when we finished that training at Columbus, Mississippi, that's when we got our wings. And my mother lived in Kansas. She was notified, and she came down and got to pin the wings on me at the ceremony at Columbus, Mississippi. We were shipped out of New York Harbor. We were crew number 13, and we left from pier number 13. I have nothing against 13. It was the third largest convoy that they said ever went across the ocean, and every place from our ship we could look, there was ships all around us. Some naval ships protecting us and so forth. When we'd moved into our barracks in our quarters there on the base, when we first got there, as soon as was moving in, why, the fellows around, they come in to introduce themselves, and we chatted. And when they got ready to leave, one of them piped up and says, "Boys, we sure hope you have better luck than the last 3 crews that was in this room." I says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, the most any of them flew was 6 missions before they were shot down." So that was our introduction to our quarters over there. We were lucky. This base, Horsham St. Faith, was the last RAF base built before World War II by the RAF, and they had just taken it over during the year before, and put the 458 bomb group on that base. And that during the 15 months that the ARPA group operated out of that base, we lost 99 airplanes off of our base in 15 months. And normally the base complement was about 65 planes that maintained there, but they could only get about half of those, around 35 they could get into the air, because they had to be repairing them or replacing the engines or time checking each thing. And so that's kind of what the situation was. We had several accidents that happened there. The Germans followed them back. They had a mission that went out late, around noon that day, and they got back at dusk, dark, and they was landing, and the German fighters had followed them back. And as they turned on their runway lights and turned on their plane lights to land, the German fighters knocked down 4 of our group that one evening before they got chased out of there. Some of them got shot down. All of our missions were in Germany, and we went as far as Berlin. Was on one of our. That was near the end of the war. The Allies they'd overcome that last drive that the Germans had made, and the Germans had been being squeezed. The Russians were coming in from the east, and the Allies coming in from the west, and the Germans were bringing a bunch of their planes out of Sweden and Italy and southern Germany, and there was an airfield that was northwest of Berlin, and they'd just brought in a whole bunch of airplanes. Well, they assigned us that day that we was to bomb that field to destroy as many airplanes as we could, and they instructed us, now, you cannot bomb if you can't see the field. The Allies and the Russians are so close to that area, we don't want to have a disaster that way. Says you can't bomb without seeing the target. Well, all the groups in front of us and the groups behind us, it was cloud covered. None of them could see the field. just as we approached it, and we was right on target, and all at once my navigator and bombardier hollered, "Hey, we see the target. Let us have it. Let me have it." I flipped a switch where the controls went to his bomb sight, where he had to hit the crosshairs on the target, and in 15 seconds, he evidently got the hairs on the target. Well, the group behind us, when they got up there, they could see the target and took pictures of the hits that was coming, that was being on the field, which destroyed the planes. But they couldn't bomb themselves because the clouds were moving and the opening wasn't right when they could bomb. Well, when they showed the pictures and saw what devastation we did, we ended up with a DFC. They said we were good, but we were just lucky. We flew 26 missions. We flew at least 4 missions besides over Germany and even got flak. But the weather got so bad we had to turn around and go back. But as long as you didn't drop bombs, you didn't get credit for your mission. And we had 4 missions that we didn't get credit for. First boys that went over there, most all the targets were in the French and the Belgian areas. The Germans had occupied all of that. And the Germans had all their fighters, and they were just, it was terrible on those boys. If you flew 11 missions, you were flying on somebody else's time. And at the time that we were flying, we had 1 chance out of 3 of completing our missions at that time. But they was even much worse at the beginning. If they got 20 missions, they could come home. And not many of them got 20 missions. I remember all the boys in my crew. My co-pilot was Dean Marshall. He was from Kearney, Nebraska. My bombardier was Don Crick. He was from Kearney, Nebraska. My navigator was Stanley Dreyer. He was Polish from Milwaukee. My radio operator was Chester Kiefer, and he was from Bryan, Ohio. My engineer was Leopoldo Gloria. He was Mexican. He was from Del Rio, Texas, originally. Had not finished high school, yet he went through all the training, and he was outstanding, and he was really a great engineer on my crew. And we were all just like family. For the period of time that we were together, we were so close. And then one of my waist gunners was Gino Scariot. He was Italian. My tail gunner was Frome, and he was from Chicago. And the English thought that anybody that was from Chicago was a renegade or a wild person. Well, he kind of was. He was kind of one of my wildest ones. Ball turret gunner was Hebb was his last name, and he became a railroad operator up in Maryland. I'm the only one of my crew that is still alive. My co-pilot, he and I was the last 2, and he died a little over a year ago. He was 6 months younger than I was. We kept in contact by phone and by letter over all the years that they continued on, especially Christmas. We'd all send a Christmas letter to every one of the other crew members, telling about what our families and our life and what we were doing and so forth. all of my crew, after we become a crew in Boise, Idaho, we had these leather jackets. And when we got over to Norwich, it's Horsham St. Faith, there was some boys that were quite good artists, and they were painting on these jackets, and we had them. All of us had pretty much the same thing. Basically, on the back we had a B-24 dropping bombs on a swastika insignia, and so everybody kind of knew our crew because it all had the same type of jacket on the painting on the back. I had on the front, I had my town of Clearwater, and I had the name Jen, Jen, which was my wife kind of nickname. Her name was Virginia, but everybody called her Jen. I had that on there, and all of our insignias on our jackets. And we were headed to Ganderfield, Newfoundland from there, and it was an 8-hour trip. And then we got to spotting icebergs. We could see icebergs down there. At first we thought it was ships, and then we could decide it was icebergs. Well, then all at once we had a fire in the cockpit. They'd taken out one of the radios before we'd left England, and they disconnected one of the wires that evidently was still hot, and the thing had sparked out and caught some of the deadening felt in the cockpit on fire, so we had to put it out. Well, we'd already lost an engine, had to go back, and when we were real late, we were a number of hours late getting into Ganderfield, and they hadn't had any word from us that we'd had to turn back. They thought we were down in the drink. So when we landed about 10 o'clock at night in Ganderfield, Newfoundland, they told us that they was getting crews together to go search for us out there because they hadn't had word from us on our flight back. We were one of the ships that was missing. And and the boys, when we landed, they come up to me, the boys is in the back. They says, we didn't tell you, but we had a bad gas leak in the bomb bay, and we was catching it in a helmet and throwing it out the window. We was scared to tell you, we were afraid you'd turn back to the Azores. So it was sort of an adventuresome trip back across the Atlantic, and thinking about it, I can't imagine me flying a plane across the Atlantic Ocean. It still amazes me today, the things that had taken place over the years. Then I was sent to Clovis, New Mexico, and had just got assigned in there, and they assigned me to take a group of majors and colonels up to Denver to a football game on Saturday. And I went out to get in the plane, and it was a B-17. And I'd never flown a 17, never been in a 17. I've been in 24s, but I'd never been in the 17. And I turned around to the co-pilot and I says, you got quite a bit of time in this 17? He says, this is my first time. I says, well, I don't mind flying it. That don't bother me at all. But I don't know the controls. I don't know the settings and everything. I called the engineer up and I says, you stand right here and answer my questions. We won't have any trouble. And we didn't have the first minute trouble on that. If that bunch of majors and colonels had known that the two had never flown a plane before, they'd had all bailed out. We did not have any occasion dangerous enough to have to bail out in any of the flying that I ever did. We were prepared for it on several occasions, but never did have to. And I never did any parachuting until I reached my 80th birthday, and my son and I celebrate our birthdays because mine's on December the 8th, his is on December the 9th. And we usually have all the family together. And at the end of the birthday party, I stood up and I says, I'm going to go skydiving. And my 22-year-old granddaughter, Dottie Clemens, she says, Grandpa, if you go, I'm going too. And she did. And I signed up to jump at 14,500 feet. You could jump at lower levels for less money, but I wanted to have the experience. So I told him that my granddaughter and I both wanted to jump. Then when it come time, it was around 4 o'clock, I think it was, before they finally says, well, if we got you ready. My instructor and I was the only one that was going double. They were all folks that have done a number of jumps. So they all went out first, and then we went out last. And we free fell. Well, when we went out, we tumbled 3 times, and then we spread out and come down at 120 mile an hour, that wind in your face. My instructor was attached to me I was in front of him. I broke the wind for him, but it was hard to breathe as that 120 mile an hour wind in your face. But you could move your arms and just move it around. And I asked him what would do if you just swing on around. So he just swung us on around like he was on a merry-go-round and coming down. And we free fell down to 6,000 feet before we opened our parachute. It seemed like we drifted for 5 minutes around sky. It was a wing-type chute, and we just flew it all around. And when we landed within 100 feet of the airplane that had already landed. And when we come in and landed, he made me hold my feet up so that I wouldn't tangle with his feet as he got his feet on the ground. When we come to the ground period, but we was scooting along pretty good, so then I got down on my seat and scooted. It was a little bit rough landing, but it wasn't real bad, and he kind of tumbled, and he finally went down off of his feet. When he sat there and was kind of getting up, and he says, you ready to go again? Well, I says, I'll be back when I'm 90. And so I made that promise I'd be back when I'm 90, so then I did it again when I was 90. So 4 of us went the second time when I was 90. And my landing couldn't have been more perfect. I didn't even hardly have any bump or anything when I landed that time. And the fellow says I was the oldest person he'd ever gone down with. Our present preacher is about 45 years old at our church. And the other day I asked him, I says, well, if I make it to 100 and if I go skydiving, you going to go with me? He looked at me he says, well, if you could do it, I'll do it too. Now I kind of regrets that he said that. He told me the other day, he says, I'm not what I spoke too soon that day.